In the genteel parlors of Millbrook, Georgia, a 78-year-old grandmother was about to deliver what everyone expected to be a traditional wedding blessing. What started as a joyous family celebration took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a calculated predator disguised as the perfect bride. Dolores Patterson wasn't your typical elderly matriarch. For 37 years, she had spent her life as a school principal, known for her ability to spot deception from across a crowded classroom and her steel backbone hidden beneath Southern grace. When she encountered Savannah Cross charming her way through the wedding reception, she had no idea she was walking into a sophisticated financial scheme that had been targeting elderly victims across 4 states. Dolores raised her champagne glass that would lead to exposing a criminal who had stolen over $500,000 from vulnerable families. What began as a grandmother's concern for her beloved grandson would become a fierce battle to save not just her family, but an entire community of elderly victims. The small town of Millbrook would never be the same after one woman chose truth over keeping the peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Dolores Patterson's antebellum home, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors she'd polished to a mirror shine the night before. At 78, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but muscle memory guided her through the final preparations for Tyler's wedding day. Each movement carried the weight of 15 years. 15 years since she'd taken in a 12-year-old boy broken by loss and helped him become the man he was today. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, adjusting the spray of magnolias on the dining room table. The flowers reminded her of Robert's funeral, then of her son David's. Too many goodbyes for one lifetime. But today was about beginnings. The grandfather clock chimed 7 as Dolores checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back had silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, eyes that had seen too much but still sparkled with fierce intelligence, and a mouth that could deliver both comfort and cutting truth with equal precision. She'd been a school principal for 37 years. She knew how to read people. Her fingers traced the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their 40th anniversary. "I wish you could see him today," she murmured to the photograph on the side table. Robert's eyes seemed to twinkle back at her, the same eyes Tyler had inherited. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted her reverie. Through the window, she watched Savannah Cross step out of her powder blue BMW, looking every inch the perfect Southern bride-to-be in her flowing sundress and wide-brimmed hat. Even at 7 in the morning, the girl was camera-ready. "Meemaw!" Savannah's voice carried that honey-sweet drawl that had charmed everyone in Millbrook from the moment Tyler brought her home 6 months ago. "I hope you don't mind me coming by so early. I just couldn't sleep a wink, thinking about all the last-minute details." Dolores opened the door with a practiced smile. "Of course not, sugar. Come on in. Coffee's fresh." As Savannah glided through the foyer, her eyes made quick, calculating sweeps of the antique furniture, the oil paintings, the crystal chandelier. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. But Dolores had spent decades watching children try to hide their intentions. "This house is just breathtaking," Savannah said, settling gracefully at the kitchen table. "Tyler's told me so much about growing up here, about how you took him in after." Her voice caught perfectly, a single tear threatening at the corner of her eye. "I just can't imagine how hard that must have been, taking on a child at your age." "Wasn't hard at all," Dolores replied, pouring coffee into her best china cups. "Tyler was the light of my life when everything seemed dark." Savannah's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "I keep thinking about our future together. Tyler works so hard at the clinic, but veterinarians don't exactly make doctor money, you know? I worry about providing for our children someday. About having the kind of security you've built here." The comment hit like a small stone in still water, sending ripples of unease through Dolores's chest. "Security isn't just about money, dear. Of course not. Savannah's smile was radiant. But it helps, doesn't it? Especially when you're thinking about family legacy. About making sure the people you love are taken care of when you're gone. Dolores set down her cup with deliberate care. There it was again, that probing quality beneath the sweet words. Is everything all right with your own family? I noticed they haven't been around much during the planning. For just a moment, something flickered across Savannah's features. Then the mask slipped back into place. Oh, Meemaw. It's just so painful to talk about. After what happened with my parents. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sometimes it's easier to build a new family than to dwell on the old wounds. The story changed each time Savannah told it. Sometimes her parents had died in an accident. Sometimes there had been a falling out. The details shifted like sand, but the emotional manipulation remained constant. I understand, sugar. Dolores reached across the table and patted Savannah's hand, noting how cold her fingers were despite the summer heat. Today's about new beginnings. 3 hours later, Dolores stood in her bedroom, struggling with the zipper of her mother-of-the-groom dress. The pale green silk had seemed perfect when she'd bought it, but now it felt too formal, too much like armor for a battle she hadn't realized she was fighting. Tyler knocked softly before entering. At 31, he still had the earnest face of the boy she'd raised, though worry lines creased his forehead. Meemaw, I need to ask you something. He perched on the edge of her bed, his wedding suit immaculate, but his hands nervous. The photographer wants payment today, and my account's running lower than I expected. The flowers cost more than we budged for, and the reception upgrades. Don't you worry about money today, Dolores interrupted, moving to her writing desk. She pulled out her checkbook, the one she'd balanced meticulously every month for 50 years. The balance made her stomach clench. $347. That couldn't be right. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the register. Wedding dress alteration, $2,800. Caterer deposit, $5,500. Floral arrangements, $3,200. Musicians, $2,000. Each entry in Savannah's delicate handwriting, each accompanied by Dolores's signature. But she didn't remember agreeing to such extravagant amounts. Meemaw? Tyler's voice seemed to come from far away. You okay? Dolores forced her features into composure, drawing on decades of classroom management. Of course, dear, just making sure I have everything in order. She wrote the check for the photographer, her signature shaky. Her funeral fund, the money she'd saved so carefully to avoid burdening Tyler with her final expenses, was nearly gone. Savannah said you insisted on paying for everything, Tyler continued, guilt evident in his voice. I told her it was too much, but she said you wanted to do this for us, that it was important to you. It is important to me, Dolores managed, though the words felt like glass in her throat. The wedding ceremony unfolded like a beautiful dream with edges sharp enough to cut. Pastor Franklin Webb's familiar voice carried across the packed church as sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting everything in jeweled colors. Tyler stood at the altar looking handsome and nervous, his eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. When Savannah appeared at the back of the church, a collective sigh rose from the congregation. She was stunning in her ivory gown, the train flowing behind her like water. But Dolores found herself studying the dress's intricate beadwork, the designer shoes, the diamond earrings that caught the light. All of it paid for with her funeral fund. Dearly beloved, Pastor Webb began, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in ministry. He'd baptized Tyler, confirmed him, watched him grow from a broken child into a good man. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Tyler Robert Patterson and Savannah Marie Cross. As the ceremony progressed, Dolores noticed Pastor Webb's glances toward Savannah. She'd known Franklin Webb for 30 years. He was troubled by something. Tyler's vows brought tears to her eyes. Her grandson spoke of love and protection, of building a life worthy of the example she'd set for him. When Savannah spoke, her words were poetry, beautiful, flowing, perfectly crafted, but they felt rehearsed, performed rather than felt. "You may kiss the bride," Pastor Webb announced, though his smile seemed forced. As rice fell like rain and the couple swept down the aisle in a blur of white silk and joy, Dolores felt a cold weight settling in her chest. The boy she'd raised was married to a stranger, a beautiful, charming stranger who knew exactly which buttons to push and which stories to tell. But today was Tyler's day. Whatever suspicions gnawed at her would have to wait. The reception beckoned, with its hidden dangers and beautiful facades. Like Savannah herself, everything looked perfect on the surface. The question was what lay beneath. The reception hall hummed with the gentle chaos of celebration, but Dolores felt as though she were watching it all through glass. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in ivory linen, while the string quartet played soft melodies that drifted between conversations and laughter. Tyler moved through the crowd with Savannah on his arm, both radiant in their newlywed glow, accepting congratulations and well wishes from family and friends who'd known him since childhood. Dolores stood near the gift table, her practiced smile fixed in place as cousin after cousin embraced her and praised the beautiful ceremony. But her mind kept returning to that checkbook balance. $347. In 6 months, her carefully maintained funeral fund had dwindled from nearly $43,000 to almost nothing. "Meemaw, you look like you've seen a ghost." Ruby Mae Patterson appeared at her elbow, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. At 55, Ruby Mae had inherited her late husband's practical nature, along with his surname. She worked as a senior manager at Millbrook First National, where she'd built a reputation for spotting financial irregularities that others missed. "Maybe I have," Dolores murmured, accepting the glass gratefully. "Ruby Mae, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Ruby Mae's expression shifted from casual concern to sharp attention. She'd seen that look on Dolores's face before, during parent-teacher conferences when a child's story didn't add up, during family gatherings when someone tried to pull one over on the family matriarch. "What's troubling you?" Dolores glanced around the reception hall, ensuring they were far enough from other guests. "Have you noticed anything unusual about my banking lately? Any patterns that seem off?" Ruby Mae's professional mask slipped into place. "You know, I can't discuss specific account details, even with family. I'm not asking you to breach confidentiality. I'm asking you to help me understand what's happened to my money." The 2 women moved toward a quiet corner, past tables where elderly relatives picked at wedding cake and shared stories about Tyler's childhood. Ruby Mae's eyes followed the movement with the practiced observation of someone who'd spent years watching for the subtle signs of financial manipulation. "How much do you think you've given Tyler and Savannah for wedding expenses?" Ruby Mae asked carefully. "I thought maybe 8 or 10,000. The dress, some flowers, the photographer." Dolores's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. "But my checkbook says different." Ruby Mae was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving across the reception hall with new intensity. The elaborate floral arrangements, the premium bar service, the professional videographer capturing every moment, details that separately might seem reasonable, but together painted a picture of expensive tastes. "At the bank, we've been seeing an uptick in elder fraud cases," Ruby Mae said quietly. "Sophisticated operations where someone gains the victim's trust, usually through a family connection. They start small, a few hundred for groceries, maybe 1,000 for car repairs. But it escalates." "You think I'm being scammed by my own grandson?" "No." Ruby Mae's response was immediate and firm. "Tyler doesn't have a deceptive bone in his body, but She paused, watching as Savannah laughed with a group of elderly aunts near the head table. Sometimes the victims aren't the ones you'd expect. Across the hall, Savannah held court with remarkable skill. She'd positioned herself among the family's older members, listening intently as they shared stories about their grandchildren, their health concerns, their plans for retirement. To casual observers, she appeared to be the perfect new family member, genuinely interested in getting to know her husband's relatives. But Dolores watched with different eyes. She noticed how Savannah steered conversations toward financial topics. Who was comfortable in retirement? Who might need help with medical expenses? Which family members had sizable estates? The girls' questions seemed caring, but they probed for information with surgical precision. "Mrs. Patterson, what a beautiful wedding." Harold Cross approached them with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. He appeared to be in his early 80s, with thick white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His suit was well-tailored but showed signs of age, and his hands trembled slightly as he extended one toward Dolores. "I'm Harold Cross," he continued, "Savannah's grandfather. I'm so sorry I missed the ceremony. My flight from Atlanta was delayed. Weather, you know how it is." Dolores accepted his handshake, noting the genuine warmth in his grip. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mr. Cross. Savannah's mentioned you, of course." But even as she spoke, something nagged at her. During the months of wedding planning, Savannah had been vague about her family, often becoming emotional when pressed for details. She'd mentioned a grandfather once or twice, but the stories had been inconsistent. Sometimes he lived in Florida, sometimes North Carolina. Sometimes he was estranged, sometimes they were close. "Please call me Pappy. Everyone does." Harold's smile was genuine, untainted by calculation. "Savannah's such a sweet girl, though I have to admit I was surprised when she called about the wedding. We hadn't spoken in quite some time." Ruby May and Dolores exchanged a look. The timeline didn't match what Savannah had told them about her family situation. "How long since you'd seen her before today?" Ruby May asked with casual interest. Harold's brow furrowed. "Must be going on 2 years now. After her grandmother passed, we lost touch. You know how families drift apart sometimes." He glanced toward Savannah, who was still engaged with the elderly relatives. "She looks so much like her grandmother did at that age. Same smile, same way of making everyone feel special." "Her grandmother?" Dolores kept her voice neutral, though warning bells chimed in her head. "I thought her grandparents had passed when she was young." "Oh no, Margaret only died about 3 years ago. Savannah took it real hard. They were close. That's when she started having her troubles." Harold's voice dropped with concern. "The drinking, the debts. I tried to help her get back on her feet, but—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't speak ill of family at her wedding." Ruby May leaned forward slightly. "What kind of troubles?" Harold glanced around nervously. "Financial, mostly. After Margaret passed, Savannah went through a rough patch, lost her job, got behind on rent. I helped where I could, but an old man on a fixed income can only do so much." "How much did you help her?" Dolores asked gently. "More than I should have, probably. About $15,000 over the past year. She said it was for a fresh start, a chance to get her life together." Harold's laugh was bitter. "Guess it worked out better than I expected, seeing her married to such a fine young man." $15,000. The number hit Dolores like a physical blow. Combined with what had disappeared from her own accounts, Savannah had extracted over $50,000 from family members in less than a year. Across the reception hall, Savannah's laugh carried over the music. She'd moved to another group of relatives, her hand resting gently on the arm of Tyler's great-aunt Mildred, who was known throughout the family for her generous heart and substantial savings account. "Mr. Cross," Ruby May said carefully, "did Savannah ever ask you to sign any papers? Power of attorney forms? Maybe loan documents? Harold's expression grew troubled. A few things. Said they were to help her get a bank account established, build her credit back up. I didn't read them too carefully. Family's family, you know? Dolores felt her blood pressure rising. Do you have copies? Should have them somewhere at home. Why? Is something wrong? Before either woman could answer, Savannah appeared, beside them as if summoned by some sixth sense. Her wedding dress rustled as she moved, and her smile was radiant, but her eyes held a coolness that hadn't been there during the ceremony. Pappy, there you are. She embraced Harold with apparent affection, though Dolores noticed how her fingers gripped his shoulders, possessive rather than loving. I was starting to worry you hadn't made it. Wouldn't miss my granddaughter's wedding, Harold replied, though something in his voice had shifted. I was just telling Mrs. Patterson and Ruby May here about how proud I am of you. Savannah's smile never wavered, but her gaze flicked between the three of them with calculating intensity. I hope Pappy wasn't boring you with old family stories. You know how grandfathers like to ramble. Not at all, Dolores said evenly. We were having a lovely conversation about family. Well, I hate to steal him away, but Tyler's been asking to meet his new grandfather properly. Savannah's hand moved to Harold's elbow with gentle but unmistakable pressure. And there are some other relatives I'd love him to meet. As she guided Harold away, Dolores caught the subtle but firm grip, the way Savannah positioned herself between Harold and their line of sight. She also caught the brief moment when Savannah's mask slipped completely, a flash of cold fury in her eyes as she looked back at them. That girl's got nerves of steel, Ruby May murmured once they were out of earshot. That girl's a predator, Dolores corrected, and she's got my grandson wrapped around her finger. They watched as Savannah introduced Harold to various family members, maintaining perfect control over each interaction. When Harold began to speak, Savannah would interrupt with a charming anecdote or redirect the conversation. She was managing the narrative with professional skill. We need to document everything, Ruby May said quietly. Bank records, dates, amounts. If this is what I think it is, we're going to need evidence. Dolores nodded, though her heart was breaking. Tyler stood across the room, beaming as he watched his new wife work the crowd. He saw her charm, her grace, her apparent love for his family. He had no idea he'd married a woman who viewed his relatives as financial resources to be harvested. How do we tell him? Dolores asked. How do we destroy his happiness on his wedding day? We don't, Ruby May replied firmly. Not today. But we start building a case, because that girl isn't going to stop with what she's already taken. As if to prove Ruby May's point, they watched Savannah engage Great Aunt Mildred in what appeared to be an intense conversation about family history. Mildred was nodding sympathetically, her purse open as she pulled out what looked like photographs. But Dolores noticed how Savannah's eyes lingered on the contents of that purse. The checkbook, the credit cards, the symbols of an elderly woman's financial independence. The string quartet began playing The Way You Look Tonight, and Tyler approached his bride for their first dance as husband and wife. Savannah transformed seamlessly from calculating manipulator to radiant bride, melting into Tyler's arms with perfect grace. As the couple swayed to the music, Dolores felt the weight of knowledge settling on her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She knew the truth now, but truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. But watching Savannah's performance, seeing how effortlessly she shifted between personas, Dolores made a decision. The girl might be skilled at manipulation, but she'd never faced a retired school principal who'd spent 40 years dealing with liars, cheats, and bullies. The real battle was just beginning. The string quartet's final notes faded as the newlyweds completed their first dance, Tyler spinning Savannah gracefully before pulling her close for a kiss that drew appreciative Applause from the gathered family and friends. The reception had reached that golden hour when the champagne had loosened tongues, the cake had been cut with ceremonial precision, and the photographer had captured every obligatory moment of matrimonial bliss. Dolores stood at her assigned table, watching the scene unfold with the careful attention of a general surveying a battlefield. The weight of her discoveries pressed against her ribs like a physical thing, making each breath deliberate. Across the room, Savannah had resumed her campaign among the elderly relatives, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a flag of conquest as she moved from table to table. Ruby May caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. They'd spent the past hour quietly gathering intelligence, and the picture that emerged was even more disturbing than Dolores had feared. Great-Aunt Mildred had already offered to help the young couple with a small loan for their first home. Cousin Beatrice was considering gifting them her late husband's vintage Cadillac. Uncle Raymond had mentioned his plans to update his will to include his new great-niece. Savannah's web was spreading with each conversation, each carefully calculated display of vulnerability and charm. The band leader approached the microphone, his voice carrying over the gentle din of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite the families to share a few words for our happy couple. We'll start with the mother of the groom's grandmother, Mrs. Dolores Patterson." Dolores felt every eye in the room turn toward her. This was the moment she'd been expected to perform since Tyler announced his engagement. The traditional blessing from the family matriarch, full of gentle wisdom and well wishes for the future. She'd given similar toasts at dozens of family gatherings over the years, her words carrying the authority of age and experience. But tonight was different. Tyler beamed at her from the head table, his face flushed with happiness and champagne. Beside him, Savannah's smile was picture-perfect, though Dolores caught the slight tension around her eyes, the way her fingers gripped her champagne flute just a fraction too tightly. Dolores rose slowly, feeling her 78 years in the yi. Protest of her knees, the slight tremor in her hands. The room fell quiet except for the soft clink of glasses and the whisper of fabric as guests turned in their chairs to face her. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying the clear authority of 4 decades in the classroom. "When I look at Tyler tonight, I see the 12-year-old boy who came to live with me after losing his parents. Broken, scared, but with such a good heart." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was familiar territory, the beloved family story of how Dolores had taken in her orphaned grandson and raised him with unwavering love. "I raised that boy to value honesty above all else, to understand that true wealth comes not from what you have, but from who you are." Dolores paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room before settling on Savannah. "And I taught him that family means everything." Savannah's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Tonight, I want to toast the bride who's already spent my funeral fund on." Dolores let the pause hang in the air like smoke. "On making this the most beautiful wedding our family has ever seen." The silence that followed was absolute. Ice cubes stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the servers paused in their movements, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Dolores continued, her voice carrying no malice, only the gentle cadence of someone sharing a family anecdote. $43,000, saved penny by penny over 15 years. Money I put aside so Tyler wouldn't have to worry about burial. Costs when my time comes. Money that bought every beautiful flower in this room, every note from that lovely string quartet, every bite of that delicious cake. Tyler's face had gone pale, his mouth slightly open as he processed his grandmother's words. Savannah's composure remained intact, but her knuckles had gone white around her champagne flute. "Of course, I don't begrudge a penny of it," Dolores said, raising her own glass. "What good is money if you can't spend it on the people you love? Though I do wonder sometimes, when you've given everything you have, what's left to give?" Pastor. Webb, seated at a table near the front, understood immediately. His expression shifted from polite attention to sharp concern, as he recognized not just the words, but their implications. "So here's to Tyler and Savannah," Dolores concluded, her voice warm but carrying an edge that cut through the reception. "Hall like a blade. May your marriage be built on the same foundation of trust and honesty that brought you together. And may you always remember that the greatest gift we can give each other is the truth." She raised her glass higher. "To the happy couple." The response was scattered, uncertain. Some guests raised their glasses automatically, trained by decades of wedding etiquette. Others sat frozen, processing what they'd just heard. The toast had been delivered with such perfect Southern grace that many weren't sure if they'd witnessed a blessing or a declaration of war. Savannah was the first to recover, rising gracefully from her chair with a smile that could have powered the chandeliers. "Thank you, Mima. Your generosity has meant the world to us. Tyler and I are so blessed to have you in our lives." But her eyes, when they met Dolores's across the room, held no warmth at all. Tyler stood slowly, confusion written across his features. "Mima, I don't understand. $43,000? I thought you were helping with some of the expenses, but we'll talk later, honey," Dolores said gently, settling back into her chair. "This is your night." But the damage was done. The reception's atmosphere had shifted like weather before, a storm. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more urgent. Dolores watched as family members leaned toward each other, whispering questions and theories. Harold Cross sat at a corner table, his face grave as he stared at his untouched slice of cake. Ruby May moved through the crowd with professional efficiency, her banker's instincts guiding her toward the relatives who'd been clustered around Savannah earlier. Great Aunt Mildred looked troubled, her purse now closed and clutched protectively in her lap. Cousin Beatrice was deep in conversation with her husband, their heads bent together in serious discussion. Savannah, for her part, handled the crisis with remarkable skill. She circulated among the guests with renewed energy, her laugh a little too bright, her explanations flowing like honey. Tyler's grandmother was getting on in years, she confided to anyone who would listen. Sometimes elderly people became confused about money, imagined things that weren't there. It was sad, really, but they were managing it with love and patience. Some guests nodded sympathetically. Others looked less convinced. 20 minutes after the toast, Tyler appeared at Dolores's side, his face flushed and his eyes bright with hurt and confusion. "Mima, we need to talk. Now." Dolores followed him to a quiet alcove near the reception hall's entrance, away from the music and conversation. Tyler's hands shook as he ran them through his hair, disturbing the careful styling that had taken an hour that morning. What was that about? His voice cracked like it hadn't since he was 15. $43,000? Your funeral fund? I don't understand any of this. Sit down, honey. Dolores guided him to a small bench, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. I need to tell you some things that are going to be hard to hear. Is this about Savannah? Are you trying to ruin my wedding day? The accusation hit harder than Dolores had expected. No, baby. I'm trying to protect you. Tyler shook his head violently. Protect me from what? From the woman I love? From the best thing that's ever happened to me? From a woman who's been systematically draining my bank account for 6 months? Dolores said quietly. From someone who's already convinced your great aunt to offer her a loan and your uncle to change his will. That's impossible. Savannah would never— Tyler, I have the bank records, the canceled checks, all with my signature but not with my memory. Tyler stared at her, his world visibly cracking. You're saying she forged your signature? I'm saying a lot of money has disappeared from my account, and I don't remember authorizing most of it. There has to be an explanation. Maybe you forgot. I forgot giving away my funeral fund? Dolores's voice carried a sharp edge. Money I've been saving for 15 years? Money I told you about every time I made a deposit? Tyler opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He knew about the funeral fund. They'd had countless conversations about it. How important it was to Dolores that she not burden him with her final expenses. How proud she was of her financial independence. She said you insisted on paying for everything, he whispered. She said you wanted to give us the wedding of our dreams. I wanted to help with your wedding. I didn't want to bankrupt myself for it. Before Tyler could respond, Harold Cross appeared in the alcove, his cane tapping against the marble floor. His face was grave, and his hands trembled more than they had earlier. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation, and I think there are some things you both need to know." Tyler looked up at the elderly man with confusion. "Mr. Cross, this really isn't about Savannah taking money from family members?" Harold's voice was steady despite his trembling hands. "About her convincing people who love her to sign papers they don't understand? About her moving from one elderly relative to another, draining accounts and disappearing?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "That's my wife." "You're talking about," Tyler said, but his voice lacked conviction. Harold sat down heavily on the bench beside them. "Son, I've been watching your wife work this room tonight, and I've seen it all before. The charm, the manipulation, the way she gathers information about people's finances." He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. "I brought these copies of the papers she had me sign. Bank authorizations, power of attorney documents, loan agreements I never understood." Dolores took the envelope with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "How much?" $15,000 over the past year. Maybe more. I stopped keeping track after my grandson warned me to be careful." Harold's laugh was bitter. "Guess I should have listened sooner." Tyler sat in stunned silence as Dolores reviewed the documents. They were sophisticated forgeries, legal-looking enough to fool an elderly man who trusted his granddaughter implicitly. "This can't be happening," Tyler murmured. "This is my wedding day. She's my wife. She loves me." "She might love you," Harold said gently, "but she loves money more. And she's very, very good at getting it from people who care about her." Through the alcove's archway, they could see the reception continuing. Savannah moved through the crowd like a politician, her smile never faltering, her composure absolute. She caught sight of their small group, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a predator recognizing that her prey had begun to organize. "What do I do?" Tyler asked, his voice broken. "How do I go back in there and pretend everything's normal?" Dolores reached for his hand, finding it cold and shaking. "You don't pretend anything, honey. You face the truth, no matter how much it hurts." But even as she spoke the words, Dolores knew the real battle was just beginning. Savannah had spent months building her web of deception, and she wouldn't abandon it without a fight. The toast had been fired like a shot across enemy lines. Now the war would begin in earnest. The silence in Dolores's antebellum home was deafening. For 3 days, the house that had echoed with Tyler's laughter for 19 years sat empty, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the whisper of her own footsteps across hardwood floors. The wedding gifts still crowded the dining room table: crystal vases, silver serving sets, engraved picture frames that would hold memories of a marriage built on lies. Dolores sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bank statements and canceled checks that Ruby May had helped her gather. Each document told the same story: systematic financial manipulation disguised as family generosity. Her reading glasses slipped down her nose as she traced the timeline of her own destruction with a trembling finger. March 15th, wedding dress. Deposit, $2,800 March 28th. Floral arrangements, $3,200 April 12th. Catering upgrade, $5,500. April 30th, string quartet, $2,000. The amounts escalated with each transaction, but what chilled her blood were the subtle differences in her own signature. Someone had practiced her handwriting with careful attention to detail. "She's good," Ruby May said from across the table, her banker's eye trained on the evidence. "These aren't amateur forgeries. Someone taught her how to do this." The front door opened without a knock. Tyler's key still worked, though Dolores wondered how long that would last. Her grandson appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face haggard and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and tears. "I came to get my things," he said without meeting her gaze. Dolores's heart shattered, but she kept her voice steady. "This will always be your home, Tyler." "No." His voice was harder than she'd ever heard it. "My home is with my wife. The wife you humiliated in front of our entire family." Ruby May started to speak, but Dolores silenced her with a look. This was between her and the boy she'd raised. "Where will you live?" Dolores asked gently. "Savannah found us a place. A little apartment downtown." Tyler's hands shook as he ran them through his unwashed hair. "She's been crying for 3 days because of what you did. Because of the lies you told. Tyler, look at these bank statements." "I don't want to see them." Tyler turned away, his shoulders rigid with defensive anger. "Savannah explained everything. You've been having memory problems, getting confused about money. It happens to people your age. We were trying to protect you." The words hit Dolores like physical blows. "Memory problems? The wedding expenses you insisted on paying, then forgot about. The checks you wrote and don't remember. Savannah's been covering for you, trying to keep the family from worrying." Tyler's voice cracked. "And you repaid her kindness by destroying our wedding day." Dolores stared at her grandson, seeing Savannah's manipulation written in every line of his defensive posture. The girl had turned Tyler's love for his grandmother into a weapon against her. "Did she show you bank records to prove these memory problems?" Ruby May asked quietly. Tyler's jaw tightened. "She doesn't need to prove anything to me. I know my wife." "Do you?" Dolores asked. "Because Harold Cross has documentation showing she's stolen $15,000 from him over the past year." Harold Cross is confused. He's lonely and making up stories for attention. Dolores recognized the words, Savannah's words, spoken in Tyler's voice. "When did you start thinking so little of your family?" Tyler turned back to face her, and the pain in his eyes was raw and terrible. "When my family started trying to destroy my marriage before it even began." He left then, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he packed his belongings. Dolores sat frozen at the kitchen table, listening to dresser drawers being yanked open, closet doors slamming shut. The sounds of her grandson erasing himself from her life. "She's isolated him completely," Ruby May observed. Classic manipulation tactic. Make the victim choose between their abuser and their support system. He chose her. He chose what he thinks is love. There's a difference. 20 minutes later, Tyler reappeared with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. His bedroom, the room where she'd nursed him through childhood illnesses, helped him with homework, listened to his teenage heartbreaks, was stripped bare. "Tyler," Dolores called as he reached the front door. He paused without turning around. "I love you," she said simply. "Nothing will ever change that." His shoulders sagged. For a moment, she thought he might turn back, might let her hold him like she had when he was 12 and broken. Instead, he walked out the door and out of her life. The next morning brought Pastor Webb to her doorstep, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grave concern. He sat in Robert's old chair in the living room, a manila folder balanced on his knees. "I've been praying about whether to share this with you," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in ministry. "But I believe you have a right to know." He opened the folder, revealing handwritten notes and printed emails. During the pre-marriage counseling sessions, I documented several inconsistencies in Savannah's background story. Each time we met, details changed: where she grew up, how her parents died, her educational background. Dolores leaned forward, reading over his careful documentation. "Why didn't you say something before the wedding?" I hoped I was wrong, that my suspicions were unfounded. Pastor Webb's voice carried deep regret. "But after your toast, I started making some calls. To churches in the towns where she claimed to have lived, to schools she supposedly attended. And no records, no one remembers her. It's as if Savannah Cross didn't exist before she came to Millbrook." The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. Savannah hadn't just lied about her finances, she'd lied about her entire identity. "There's more," Pastor Webb continued. "I contacted a colleague in Valdosta where Savannah claimed to have attended college. He put me in touch with a detective who's been tracking a series of elder fraud cases across South Georgia." Dolores felt her blood pressure spike. Cases involving someone matching Savannah's description? 3 elderly victims over the past 2 years, all targeted through romantic relationships with their grandsons or nephews. All suffered significant financial losses before the perpetrator disappeared. Ruby May whistled low. "She's a professional." "The detective's name is Maria Santos. She specializes in crimes against the elderly." Pastor Webb handed Dolores a business card. "I took the liberty of giving her your contact information." That afternoon, Harold Cross visited again, this time bringing a shoebox full of documents and photographs. His hands trembled as he laid out the evidence of his own victimization. Forged checks, manipulated bank statements, legal documents he'd signed without understanding their implications. "I was lonely," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "After my Margaret died, Savannah was the only family I had left. Or so I thought." "She's not really your granddaughter?" Dolores asked, though she already knew the answer. Harold shook his head. "I don't think she's related to me at all. I've been going through Margaret's things, looking for any mention of a granddaughter named Savannah. Nothing. Not in her address book, not in her correspondence, not even in the family Bible." The 3 of them sat in Dolores's living room, as the afternoon sun slanted through lace curtains, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded. Savannah had targeted their family with military precision, identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. "What do we do now?" Harold asked. Dolores looked at the business card Pastor Webb had given her, then at the faces of the people who'd chosen to stand with her when her own grandson had turned away. "We call Detective Santos," she said firmly, "and we stop her before she destroys anyone else's family." But even as she spoke, Dolores knew the hardest battle lay ahead. Tyler was lost to Savannah's manipulation, and breaking that hold would require more than evidence or good intentions. It would require a miracle. Or it would require Savannah to make a mistake big enough to shatter Tyler's illusions forever. In her heart, Dolores prayed it would be the former, but she prepared for the latter. Detective Maria Santos arrived at Dolores's home on a Thursday morning that carried the first hint of autumn in its breeze. She was younger than Dolores had expected, perhaps 41 or 42, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of competent authority that immediately put the elderly woman at ease. Santos carried herself with the measured confidence of someone who'd seen every variation of human cruelty and still chose to fight it. "Mrs. Patterson," Santos said, accepting the offered seat at the kitchen table. "Pastor Webb has filled me in on some of the details, but I'd like to hear your story from the beginning." Dolores had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but facing the reality of involving law enforcement made her hands shake as she poured coffee into her best china cups. Ruby May sat beside her, a manila folder thick with evidence positioned between them like a shield. "6 months ago, my grandson brought home the most charming young woman I'd ever met," Dolores began, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath. Beautiful, well-mannered, everything a grandmother could want for her boy. Santos nodded, her pen moving across a legal pad with practiced efficiency. When did you first give Savannah money? March, I think. She mentioned needing a wedding dress, and Tyler was concerned about the cost. I offered to help. Dolores's voice grew quieter. That's when it started. Over the next hour, Santos listened without judgment as Dolores and Ruby May laid out their evidence. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, canceled checks bearing signatures that looked authentic but felt wrong, a timeline of financial manipulation that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. The amounts escalated gradually, Ruby May explained, her banker's training evident in her analysis. Classic grooming behavior. Start small to establish trust, then increase the requests once the victim is emotionally invested. Santos studied the documents with the attention of someone who'd seen similar patterns before. Mrs. Patterson, in your professional opinion, would you say these signatures are forgeries? Ruby May held up two checks side by side. Look at the D in Dolores. The authentic signature has a slight tremor, natural for someone Mrs. Patterson's age. But the forged ones are too smooth, too practiced. Someone traced these repeatedly to get them right. $43,000, Santos murmured, calculating the total. That's felony territory. Dolores felt a chill run through her chest. The reality of involving police made everything more concrete, more frightening. What happens now? Now we investigate properly. Santos closed her notepad and leaned forward, her expression gentle but determined. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand that this kind of case can be complicated. Elder fraud often involves family members, which makes prosecution difficult. Victims sometimes refuse to cooperate because they don't want to hurt their loved ones. Tyler doesn't know, Dolores said quietly. He thinks I'm having memory problems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's part of her strategy. Isolate the victim, discredit their testimony, make them doubt their own perceptions. Santos's voice carried hard-earned expertise. I've seen it dozens of times. Ruby May leaned forward. What can we do to help? Keep documenting everything. Any contact with Savannah, any unusual financial activity, any attempts to access accounts or sign documents. Santos handed them each a business card. And call me immediately if she tries to leave town, or if Tyler mentions any major financial decisions. After Santos left, Dolores sat in her empty house feeling both hope and dread. The investigation was beginning, but Tyler was still trapped in Savannah's web, still believing his grandmother was losing her mind. Across town, in the small apartment Tyler had rented above the hardware store, Savannah was conducting her own damage assessment. She stood at the kitchen window, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. The old woman went to the police, she said to the person on the other end. Some detective named Santos. I need to accelerate the timeline. Tyler sat in the living room, unaware of the conversation happening 10 feet away. He'd lost weight. In the week since the wedding, his face gaunt with stress and confusion. The veterinary practice that had been his pride and joy now felt like a burden he could barely manage. Baby, Savannah called, ending her phone call and moving to sit beside him on the second-hand couch. I've been thinking about our future. Tyler looked up at her with eyes that held too much pain for a man just returned from his honeymoon. What about it? We need to think practically about our finances. Your grandmother's accusations, the family drama, it's affecting your business. Mrs. Henderson canceled her appointment yesterday, and I heard the Jameson family is taking their animals to the clinic in Tifton. Tyler's shoulders sagged. He'd noticed the cancellations, the way some longtime clients avoided eye contact when they brought their pets in. The whispers stopped when he entered rooms, but he could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Maybe we should consider a fresh start, Savannah continued, her voice carrying just the right mix of hope and uncertainty. Somewhere new, where we can build our own reputation. Leave Millbrook? Tyler looked shocked. This is my home. My practice is here. Your practice is failing because of your grandmother's lies. Savannah's tone sharpened slightly before she caught herself. I'm sorry, honey. I know this is hard, but sometimes love means making difficult choices. She pulled out a folder of documents she'd prepared earlier. I've been researching veterinary practices for sale in other states. Look at this one in South Carolina. It's perfect for us. Tyler flipped through the listings without enthusiasm. These cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We don't have that kind of money. We could if we liquidated your current assets, sold the practice, cashed out your retirement accounts, used the equity in your grandmother's house. Meemaw's house isn't mine to sell. Savannah's smile was patient, but her eyes flashed with irritation. Of course not. But you're her heir, aren't you? Banks will lend against future inheritance, and given her condition, it might be wise to establish power of attorney now, while she's still competent enough to sign. Tyler stared at the documents, his mind struggling to process what his wife was suggesting. You want me to take control of Meemaw's finances? I want us to protect your family's assets before your grandmother's memory problems get worse. Savannah's voice carried perfect concern. What if she starts giving money to strangers? What if she falls victim to some scammer who takes advantage of elderly people? The irony was lost on Tyler, but it hit Savannah like a physical force. She was describing exactly what she'd already done, using Tyler's love for his grandmother as a weapon against them both. 3 miles away, Pastor Webb sat in his church office, making the most difficult phone calls of his ministerial career. The list of names before him represented his congregation's most vulnerable members, elderly widows and widowers who'd mentioned recent financial help they'd given to new family friends. Mrs. Chen, he said into the phone, this is Pastor Webb. I was wondering if you could tell me about that young woman who's been helping you with your grocery shopping. The pattern that emerged over the next 2 hours made his stomach turn. Savannah hadn't limited her activities to the Patterson family. She'd systematically targeted isolated elderly people throughout the community, each time using a different backstory, a different set of needs. Mrs. Chen had given her $3,000 to help with medical bills for a sick cousin. Mr. Rodriguez had co-signed a car loan for someone he believed was his deceased wife's great-niece. The Morrison twins had jointly gifted $5,000 to help a family friend start a business. Pastor Webb documented each case with growing horror, realizing that Savannah's operation was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. By the time he finished his calls, the scope of the fraud exceeded $60,000 across 7 victims. He immediately called Detective Santos. 7 victims in your congregation alone? Santos's voice carried controlled anger. This isn't opportunistic crime. This is organized, systematic exploitation. What can we do? I'm going to need statements from each victim, and I need to contact other law enforcement agencies. If she's this organized here, she's probably worked other communities. Santos spent that evening on the phone with detectives across the Southeast, building a case that grew more damning with each conversation. By midnight, she'd identified similar patterns of elder fraud in 4 different states, all involving a young woman matching Savannah's physical description. Her real name is Sarah Vance, Santos told Dolores the next morning. Age 29, born in Detroit, extensive juvenile record for fraud and theft. She's been running cons on elderly people for at least 8 years. Dolores felt the room spin slightly. 8 years? She's sophisticated, Mrs. Patterson. Professional. She studies communities before she moves in, identifies the most vulnerable targets, and builds elaborate cover stories. The marriage to your grandson was just her latest method of gaining credibility. Ruby May leaned forward. How many other victims? Officially, at least 30 across 4 states, but I suspect there are more who haven't reported the crimes. Santos's expression was grim. The total dollar amount exceeds $500,000. The number hit Dolores like a physical blow. $500,000 stolen from elderly people who'd trusted someone they thought was family. How do we stop her? We're building a case, but it takes time. Meanwhile, she's had access to your grandson for 6 months. Has he mentioned any major financial decisions lately? Dolores's blood went cold. Tyler has a veterinary practice, retirement accounts, and he's my heir. Santos nodded grimly. I'm going to need a list of all his assets, banks, investment accounts, insurance policies, everything. Because if Sarah Vance follows her usual pattern, she's about to liquidate everything she can get her hands on and disappear. What about Tyler? That depends on how much he knows. If he's truly innocent, she'll abandon him when the money runs out. If he's complicit. Santos left the sentence unfinished. Dolores felt tears threaten for the first time since this nightmare began. He's not complicit. He's just in love with someone who doesn't exist. Then we need to move fast, Santos said, because Sarah Vance doesn't leave witnesses behind. That afternoon, while Dolores was meeting with Detective Santos, Tyler sat in his apartment signing document after document that Savannah placed before him. Power of attorney forms that would give her access to his accounts. Loan applications, using his veterinary practice as collateral. Insurance beneficiary changes that made her the sole recipient of his policies. These are just precautionary measures, Savannah explained, her voice soothing as she watched him sign away his financial independence. With all the stress from your family situation, we need to make sure our future is secure. Tyler signed, mechanically, his trust in his wife absolute even as his world crumbled around him. He didn't notice how her eyes gleamed with each signature, or how she immediately photographed each document with her phone. By evening, Sarah Vance had legal access to everything Tyler Patterson owned, and she was already planning her exit strategy. The only question was whether Detective Santos could build her case fast enough to stop a predator who'd perfected her craft over 8 years of destroying families. Time was running out, and everyone involved knew it. The endgame was about to begin. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, jarring Dolores from restless sleep. Detective Santos's voice was tight with urgency. Mrs. Patterson, we need to move fast. Sarah Vance tried to access Tyler's business account at 4 a.m. this morning. The bank's fraud detection system flagged it as suspicious. Someone attempting to transfer $73,000 to an offshore account. Dolores sat up in bed, her heart hammering. $73,000? His entire business savings, plus a line of credit she somehow got approved using forged documents. Santos's voice carried controlled fury. She's making her move. I've got a warrant to freeze the accounts, but she's going to realize something's wrong when the transfers fail. Where's Tyler? That's what I need to find out. Can you meet me at his clinic in 20 minutes? Dolores dressed with shaking hands, her mind racing through possibilities. Savannah was cornered now, her careful facade cracking under the pressure of a closing investigation. That made her desperate. And desperate predators were dangerous. Tyler's veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, a modest brick building he'd renovated with his own hands after graduating veterinary school. His pride and joy, the physical manifestation of everything he'd worked toward since childhood. Dolores pulled into the empty parking lot just as Detective Santos arrived with 2 patrol cars. His truck's here, Santos observed, pointing to Tyler's familiar Ford pickup. But the lights are off inside. They approached the building carefully, Santos leading with her hand resting on her service weapon. Through the front windows, they could see Tyler sitting at the reception desk, his head in his hands. Alone. The door was unlocked. Tyler? Dolores called softly as they entered. Her grandson looked up with eyes red from crying and confusion. Mima, what are you doing here? And why are there police? He saw Detective Santos and the officers behind her, and his face went pale. "What's happening?" "Where's your wife, son?" Santos asked gently. Tyler's hand moved protectively to his phone. "She went to Atlanta. Some kind of family emergency. Her grandfather had a heart attack." Dolores felt her own heart break at the lie. Harold Cross was probably at home, unaware he was being used as cover for Savannah's escape. "Tyler," Santos continued, "when did you last check your business? Bank account?" What? Why would you ask that?" Tyler stood unsteadily, confusion written across his features. Is this about Mima's accusations? Because Savannah explained all of that. The memory problems, the confusion. "Your wife attempted to steal $73,000 from your business account at 4 this morning," Santos said quietly. The words hit Tyler like a physical blow. He staggered backward, gripping the desk for support. "That's impossible. Savannah doesn't even have access to those accounts." Santos pulled out a folder of documents. "She does now. Power of attorney forms, co-signatory agreements, loan applications, all bearing your signature." Tyler's face went ashen as he recognized the documents Savannah had presented to him as precautionary measures. The same documents he'd signed without reading, trusting his wife implicitly. "I need to see the bank statements," he whispered. Santos handed him printouts that painted a devastating picture. Over the past 2 weeks, systematic withdrawals had drained Tyler's business accounts. Equipment purchases that were never delivered, consulting fees for services never rendered. Each transaction bearing Tyler's electronic signature, signatures Savannah had obtained access to through the power of attorney documents. $37,000, Tyler read aloud, his voice breaking. Gone. The other 36,000 was supposed to transfer this morning, Santos explained. That's when our fraud alert caught it. Tyler sank into his desk chair, the evidence scattered before him like shards of his shattered life. "She said it was for our future, that we needed to protect our assets from family drama." Dolores moved closer to her grandson, her maternal instincts overriding months of hurt and anger. "Tyler, honey, there's more you need to know." Santos opened another folder, this one containing photographs and police reports. "Your wife's real name is Sarah Vance. She's been running elder fraud schemes across 4 states for 8 years. This photograph was taken in Tennessee 2 years ago, after she stole $48,000 from an elderly couple through their grandson." Tyler stared at the booking photo, unmistakably Savannah, but with different hair and a cold expression he'd never seen before. This can't be real. "She's not from Georgia," Santos continued. "She's not a grieving orphan. She doesn't have a grandfather named Harold Cross. She chose that identity because she'd already victimized the real Harold Cross and knew his family history." Each revelation hit Tyler like a separate blow. The woman he'd fallen in love with, married, given his heart to completely, she was a fiction. A carefully constructed lie designed to exploit his trust and steal his money. "The wedding," he whispered. "Mima's funeral fund." $43,000, Dolores confirmed gently. "All of it gone to pay for a wedding to someone who was robbing us both." Tyler's composure finally shattered. He put his head in his hands and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the core of his being. Dolores moved to comfort him, but Santos held up a warning hand. "Tyler," the detective said carefully, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did you know about any of the financial irregularities? Did you help forge any signatures or documents?" Tyler looked up through his tears, his face a mask of devastation and betrayal. "I thought I was protecting her. She said Mima was having memory problems, that she was getting confused about money. I thought—" His voice broke again. "I thought I was being a good husband." Santos studied his face with professional assessment. After 20 years in law enforcement, She'd learned to recognize genuine shock and grief. Tyler Patterson wasn't a criminal. He was a victim. Where did she say she was going in Atlanta? Santos asked. Piedmont Hospital. Said her grandfather was in intensive care. Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But there is no grandfather, is there? No. Harold Cross was one of her earlier victims. She used his identity to gain credibility with your family. Tyler's phone buzzed with a text message. His hand trembled as he read it aloud. Grandfather stable. Staying another night. Love you. Santos was already signaling to one of the patrol officers. She's still local. Probably holed up somewhere, waiting to see if the transfers went through. As if summoned by their conversation, the clinic's front door opened. Savannah walked in carrying coffee and pastries, her face bright with manufactured cheer. She was halfway through calling out, "Good morning, baby," when she saw the police cars through the window. Her expression shifted instantly. The mask of loving wife dissolving to reveal the calculating predator beneath. But she was good. Even caught red-handed, she attempted to maintain her cover. Tyler, honey, what's wrong? Are you hurt? She moved toward him with apparent concern, but Santos stepped between them. Sarah Vance, Santos said formally, you're under arrest for elder fraud, identity theft, and financial crimes. Savannah's laugh was cold and sharp. I think you're confused, Detective. My name is Savannah Cross. I'm Mrs. Tyler Patterson. She held up her left hand, displaying the wedding ring Tyler had placed there just 10 days earlier. Cut the act, Santos replied. We know who you are. We know about Tennessee, Alabama, Florida. We know about the real Harold Cross and the 30 other elderly people you've victimized. For a moment, the room held perfect silence. Then Savannah's facade cracked completely. The sweet southern belle disappeared, replaced by someone Tyler had never seen before, someone with ice in her veins and calculations running constantly behind her eyes. You have no idea what you're dealing with, she said, her voice stripped of its honeyed accent. Tyler signed those documents willingly. He gave me power of attorney. Everything I did was legal. Everything you did was fraud, Santos countered. Obtained through deception and forgery. Savannah turned to Tyler, and for the first time since he'd known her, her expression held no warmth at all. You stupid, naive fool. Do you have any idea how easy you were? How pathetically desperate for love? Tyler recoiled as if she'd struck him. This was his wife, the woman who'd whispered promises of forever just days ago. Now she stood before him like a stranger, cruel and calculating. I gave you the best performance of my career, Savannah continued, her voice dripping with contempt. The grieving orphan, the perfect bride, the devoted granddaughter-in-law. You ate it up like candy. Dolores stepped forward, her own anger finally breaking through her restraint. You targeted my family. You stole my funeral fund and turned my grandson against me. Savannah's smile was razor-sharp. Your funeral fund was just the beginning, old woman. If you hadn't gotten suspicious, I'd have had Tyler liquidate everything. Your house, your investments, your life insurance. I'd have cleaned you out completely and disappeared before you knew what hit you. Tyler stood slowly, his face a mask of devastation and dawning fury. Did you ever love me? Any of it? Savannah looked at him with something approaching pity. Love? Tyler? You were a mark. Means to an end. The only thing I love about you is your signature on those bank documents. The truth hit Tyler like a physical blow, but this time anger followed close behind the pain. You destroyed my family. You made me choose between my wife and my grandmother. I made you choose between reality and fantasy. Not my fault you chose poorly. Santos moved forward with handcuffs. Enough. Sarah Vance, you have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning continued, Savannah's eyes never left Tyler's face. Even now, even caught and cornered, she seemed to be calculating angles, looking for weaknesses to exploit. "This isn't over," she said quietly as Santos secured the handcuffs. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've cost yourselves. The money's gone, Tyler. Your business is ruined. Your family's reputation is destroyed. I may go to prison, but your life is still in ruins." She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Even with her arrest, the damage was done. Tyler's accounts were drained, his business crippled, his relationship with his grandmother fractured perhaps beyond repair. But as Tyler looked at his grandmother, really looked at her for the first time since the wedding, he saw something that gave him hope. He saw love. Unconditional, unwavering love that had endured his betrayal and protected him even when he'd turned against her. "Meemaw," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Dolores opened her arms, and Tyler fell into them like the broken child he'd once been. They held each other as Detective Santos led Sarah Vance away in handcuffs, beginning the long process of healing from a betrayal that had nearly destroyed them both. The predator was captured, but the real work was just beginning. The holding cell at the Millbrook police station had never contained anyone quite like Sarah Vance. She sat on the narrow bench with perfect posture, her wedding dress replaced by an orange jumpsuit that somehow couldn't diminish her calculated composure. Even behind bars, she radiated the predatory intelligence that had made her so successful for 8 years. Detective Santos observed her through the one-way glass, studying the woman who'd nearly destroyed the Patterson family. "She's been asking to see Tyler for the past 2 hours. Ruby May stood beside Santos, her banker's instinct still analyzing the threat. "You're not going to allow it, are you?" "Tyler's an adult. If he wants to see his wife, I can't stop him." Santos's voice carried professional neutrality, but her eyes remained hard. "Though I can make sure it's monitored and controlled." Through the glass, they watched Sarah check her reflection in the metal surface of the sink, smoothing her hair with practiced movements. Even in custody, she was preparing for a performance. The door to the observation room opened, and Tyler entered with Dolores close behind. His face showed the ravages of the past 24 hours, eyes red-rimmed from crying, cheeks hollow from stress, his usually neat appearance disheveled and broken. "I need to talk to her," Tyler said quietly. "I need to understand." Dolores placed a protective hand on his arm. "Tyler, honey, you don't owe her anything. I owe myself the truth." Tyler's voice carried a new hardness that hadn't been there before the wedding. 8 months of my life. Every moment was a lie. Every conversation was manipulation. I need to look her in the eye and hear her admit it. Santos nodded slowly. "I understand. But this conversation happens in the interview room with cameras, recording, and it ends the moment she becomes threatening or manipulative." 20 minutes later, Tyler sat across a metal table from the woman he'd married. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on both their faces, making Sarah look older and more calculating than he'd ever seen her. "Hello, husband," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mix of mockery and residual charm. "Come to gloat over your victory?" Tyler studied her face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd fallen in love with. "I came to ask you why." "Why?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Why did I choose you? Why did I target your pathetic little family? Why did I waste 8 months of my life in this backwater town? Why did you make me believe you loved me?" The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, something flickered across Sarah's features. Not regret, but perhaps recognition of genuine pain. "Because you made it so easy," she said finally. The grieving veterinarian, raised by his sweet grandmother, desperate for someone to love. "You practically begged to be victimized." Tyler absorbed the blow without flinching. "Did any of it mean anything to you? The conversations, the plans we made, the sex? Sarah's smile was cruel. You were adequate. Nothing special. But you served your purpose. In the observation room, Dolores gripped Ruby May's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Watching Tyler endure this psychological torture was almost unbearable, but she recognized the necessity. He needed to see Sarah's true nature completely, without the softening filter of love or hope. Tyler leaned forward slightly. What about Harold Cross, an old man who thought you were his granddaughter? Harold was Practice, a lonely widower with more money than sense. Sarah's voice carried no shame at all. He gave me $15,000 and signed power of attorney documents, without reading them. If you hadn't all gotten suspicious, I'd have cleaned him out completely. He trusted you. Trust is a weakness I exploit, just like I exploited your pathetic need for family approval and your grandmother's desire to see you happy. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full scope of her manipulation. When he spoke again, his voice was steady. The wedding. Making me choose between you and me, Ma. That was deliberate. Of course it was deliberate. Isolate the victim from their support system. Manipulation 101. Sarah leaned back in her chair, enjoying the pain on Tyler's face. Though I have to admit, your grandmother was more perceptive than I anticipated. That toast at the reception nearly ruined everything. She was trying to protect me. She was trying to protect her precious funeral fund. Selfish old woman, hoarding money while her grandson struggled to build a life. Tyler's hands clenched into fists on the table. Don't talk about her like that. Or what? You'll defend her honor? Sarah's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. You spent a week hating her because of me, choosing me over the woman who raised you. How does that feel, Tyler? Knowing you betrayed the person who loved you most for someone who saw you as nothing. But a bank account? The words hit their target perfectly. Tyler's face crumpled with guilt and self-recrimination. In the observation room, Dolores fought the urge to storm into the interview room and shield her grandson from further abuse. But Tyler surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of breaking down, he straightened his shoulders and looked Sarah directly in the eyes. You're right, he said quietly. I did betray her. I chose you over the woman who sacrificed everything for me. But you know what? That's on me, not her. And it's something I can fix. Sarah's expression shifted slightly. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. You can't fix the damage to your business, she continued, trying to regain control. $37,000. Gone. Your reputation in this town. Destroyed. Your relationship with your family. Permanently damaged. Maybe. But at least I know who I really am now, instead of who you wanted me to be. Tyler stood slowly, preparing to leave. That's when Sarah played her final card. Sit down, Tyler. We're not finished. Something in her voice made him pause. The predatory charm was gone, replaced by something colder and more dangerous. You think this is over? Because I'm in custody? You think your precious family is safe now? Sarah's smile was razor sharp. I've spent 8 months learning every secret your family has. Every weakness, every shame, every buried embarrassment. Tyler remained standing, but his expression grew wary. Your grandmother's medical records, for instance. The early signs of dementia her doctor's been monitoring. The medication she takes for depression. The real reason your parents died in that car accident. Tyler's blood went cold. What are you talking about? Your father was drinking, Tyler. Drunk when he crashed that car. Your mother died because your father was a drunk, and your precious Meemaw covered it up to protect your memory of him. The words hit Tyler like physical blows. His parents' death had been the defining tragedy of his childhood, but he'd always been told it was just an accident, black ice, poor visibility, tragic circumstances. That's not true. Court records are public information if you know where to look. Blood alcohol level 0.14. Your grandmother paid off a coroner's assistant to alter the initial report. Tyler sank back into his chair, the revelation devastating. In the observation room, Dolores closed her eyes in pain. She'd hoped that particular secret would die with her. And that's just the beginning, Sarah continued, pressing her advantage. Ruby May's gambling problem that nearly cost her the bank job. Pastor Webb's son's arrest for drug dealing. Your grandmother's affair with Robert's business partner 20 years ago. Each revelation was a dagger thrust, designed to cause maximum damage. Sarah had spent months gathering ammunition, and now she was firing every shot. You want to destroy me? Fine, but I'll take your entire family down with me. Every secret, every shame, every carefully buried truth, I'll expose it all. Tyler looked at her across the table, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of her malice. You'd destroy innocent people just for revenge? I'd burn this entire town to the ground if it served my purposes. Sarah's mask had dropped completely now, revealing the predator in full. Unless, of course, you help me. Help you what? Escape. You have keys to the veterinary clinic. There's a back entrance the police aren't watching. Meet me there tonight at midnight with $5,000 cash and a car. Tyler stared at her in disbelief. You want me to help you flee? I want you to choose between enabling my escape and watching me destroy every person you care about. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Your grandmother's reputation, your family's standing in the community, the church your precious pastor has built. I can tear it all down with a few phone calls to the right journalists. The threat hung between them like poison gas. Tyler could see the calculation in Sarah's eyes, the cold assessment of leverage and weakness that had made her so successful. But he could also see something else. Desperation. For all her threats and manipulation, Sarah was trapped. Her accounts were frozen, her escape routes blocked, her criminal history exposed. She was a cornered predator, and that made her more dangerous than ever. And if I help you escape? Then your family's secrets stay buried. I disappear. You never see me again. And everyone gets to maintain their precious illusions. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. In the observation room, Detective Santos was already calling for backup, preparing for the possibility that Tyler might actually consider Sarah's offer. When Tyler finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. No. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't the response she'd calculated. No, Tyler repeated, standing again. I won't help you escape. I won't be part of your schemes anymore. And I won't let you hurt my family. You're making a mistake, Tyler. Those secrets are just secrets. Pain and shame and human mistakes that don't define who we are. Tyler's voice grew stronger with each word. You think exposing my father's drinking will destroy me? I've lived with the guilt of their death for 19 years. Learning the truth might actually help. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Your grandmother's affair happened 20 years ago between two lonely adults. It doesn't change. The fact that she's the strongest, most loving person I know. The church scandal will be handled by people who understand forgiveness and redemption, concepts you've never learned. Tyler leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. You want to know the difference between you and my family? We make mistakes, but we own them. We hurt each other sometimes, but we forgive. We're not perfect, but we're real. Sarah stared at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The naive, trusting Mark she'd married was gone, replaced by someone with steel in his backbone. You'll regret this, she said quietly. Maybe. But I'll regret it as myself. not as whoever you wanted me to be." Tyler turned and walked toward the door. Sarah's voice followed him, carrying a final desperate plea. "Tyler, wait. What we had was real. At least some of it. I do care about you." He paused at the door without turning around. "No, Sarah, you don't. And that's the only honest thing you've said since I met you." As Tyler left the interview room, Sarah sat alone at the metal table, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. For 8 years, she'd moved from victim to victim, leaving destruction in her wake without ever facing real consequences. But Tyler Patterson had just taught her something she'd never expected to learn. Sometimes love really is stronger than manipulation, and sometimes the victims fight back. In the hallway outside, Tyler collapsed against the wall, his legs finally giving out under the emotional weight of the confrontation. Dolores was there immediately, wrapping him in her arms as he wept for the second time in 2 days. "It's over," she whispered into his hair. "It's finally over." But even as she comforted her grandson, Dolores knew Sarah's threats weren't empty. The woman had gathered enough ammunition to damage everyone Tyler cared about, and cornered predators were capable of anything. The legal battle was won, but the war for their family's reputation was just beginning, and Sarah Vance had nothing left to lose. 6 months after Sarah Vance's arrest, the Millbrook courthouse buzzed with activity that hadn't been seen since the county's founding. Media vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray November sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Inside, the largest courtroom was packed with victims, families, law enforcement officers, and journalists documenting what prosecutors called one of the most extensive elder fraud schemes in Southeast history. Dolores sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap, watching as the woman who'd nearly destroyed her family was led to the defendant's table in shackles. Sarah Vance had lost weight during her months in custody, her hair pulled back severely and her orange jumpsuit a far cry from the elegant wedding dress she'd worn when this nightmare began. Beside Dolores, Tyler shifted nervously in his seat. He'd aged years in the past 6 months, the stress and guilt carving lines around his eyes that made him look older than his 31 years. Today he would testify against the woman he'd married, a legal requirement that felt like another layer of betrayal piled onto an already insurmountable mountain of pain. "The state calls Tyler Patterson to the stand," announced Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Morrison, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years prosecuting financial crimes. Tyler's legs felt unsteady as he walked to the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with Sarah but acutely aware of her presence. He'd seen her once since their confrontation in the holding cell, during a preliminary hearing where she'd sat silent and stone-faced while charges were read. 37 counts of elder fraud, 14 counts of identity theft, 23 counts of forgery. The numbers were staggering. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison began gently, "can you tell the court how you met the defendant?" Tyler's voice was steady but quiet as he recounted the story that had become painfully familiar through months of depositions and interviews. The charming woman at the farmer's market, the whirlwind romance, the introduction to his family. Each detail felt like picking at a wound that refused to heal. "Did you know about your wife's criminal activities?" "No." Tyler's answer was immediate and firm. "I believed everything she told me, about her background, her family, her feelings. For me, all of it was lies." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Can you describe the impact her actions had on your family?" Tyler's composure finally cracked. "She stole my grandmother's funeral fund, $43,000 saved over 15 years. She turned me against the woman who raised me, made me choose between my wife and my family." His voice broke. "She nearly destroyed us." From the defendant's table, Sarah watched Tyler's testimony with cold calculation, as if she were observing a particularly interesting experiment rather than facing the consequences of her crimes. When Tyler stepped, Down, he was replaced by Harold Cross, who moved slowly to the witness stand with the aid of his carved wooden cane. At 82, Harold had become the prosecution's most compelling witness, a lonely widower whose trust had been systematically exploited. "She came to my house once a week for 8 months, Harold testified, his voice trembling with emotion. "Called me grandpappy, brought me groceries, listened to my stories about Margaret. I thought I'd found family again after losing my wife." Morrison guided Harold through the timeline of his victimization with gentle precision. The small requests for help that escalated into major financial assistance, the documents he'd signed without understanding their implications, the gradual drain of his retirement savings. "How much money did you give to the defendant, Mr. Cross?" $18,437. Harold's voice was steady now, strengthened by righteous anger. "Every penny of the emergency fund Margaret and I saved for our final years." Detective Santos, seated in the gallery, watched as Harold's testimony visibly affected the jury. Elder fraud was often dismissed as a victimless crime, but Harold Cross put a human face on the devastating impact of financial manipulation. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, recorded phone calls, testimony from 34 victims across 4 states. Sarah Vance had built a criminal enterprise that spanned nearly a decade, targeting the elderly with surgical precision. When Sarah's defense attorney attempted to paint her as a product of foster care abandonment, who'd made poor choices, Morrison was ready with evidence of the sophisticated planning that went into each scheme. False identities, fabricated backstories, careful research into victims' financial situations. This wasn't desperation. It was calculated predation. On the trial's final day, Sarah Vance took the stand in her own defense. She wore a conservative blue dress, her hair styled softly, her demeanor carefully crafted to project remorse and vulnerability. But Dolores could see through the performance. The same calculating intelligence that had charmed Tyler still lurked behind Sarah's eyes. "I made mistakes," Sarah testified, her voice carrying just the right tremor of emotion. "I was young, alone, and I made choices I deeply regret. But I never intended to hurt anyone." Morrison's cross-examination was devastating. She presented evidence of Sarah's multiple identities, her pattern of targeting elderly victims through their family connections, her sophisticated money laundering techniques. Each question stripped away another layer of Sarah's carefully constructed facade. "Ms. Vance, did you or did you not tell Mr. Patterson that you would burn this entire town to the ground if it served your purposes?" Sarah's composure finally cracked. "That was taken out of context. I was upset, facing jail time, for crimes you committed, correct? Crimes that stole the life savings of 34 elderly victims?" The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. "Guilty on all counts." The words echoed through the packed courtroom like thunder. Sarah's face went pale as the verdicts were read. 37 guilty counts that would likely result in decades in prison. For the first time since her arrest, she looked genuinely shocked. Judge Margaret Foster's sentencing 2 weeks later was swift and decisive. "Ms. Vance, you targeted the most vulnerable members of our society with calculated cruelty. Your crimes represent a betrayal of the basic trust that holds communities together. This court sentences you to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 12 years. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, she finally looked at Tyler, not with calculation or manipulation, but with something that might have been genuine regret. Tyler met her gaze for a moment, then turned away. That chapter of his life was finally closed. Outside the courthouse, Detective Santos gathered the victims and their families for a final briefing. Through asset forfeiture, they'd recovered approximately 60% of the stolen funds. It wasn't everything, but it was more than most elder fraud victims ever saw. "Mrs. Patterson," Santos said, handing Dolores a check for $26,000. This represents the portion of your losses we were able to recover. Dolores stared at the check, her funeral fund partially restored, but her sense of security forever changed. What happens now? Now you heal, Santos replied simply. All of you. It won't be easy, but you've survived the worst of it. Tyler stood beside his grandmother, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The trust between them was still fragile, still being rebuilt day by day, but it was growing stronger. We're going to be okay? Tyler said quietly, as much to himself as to Dolores. Dolores looked at her grandson, scarred by betrayal but stronger for having survived it, and allowed herself to believe him. They had lost money, innocence, and illusions. But they had found each other again, and that was worth more than any amount Sarah Vance could have stolen. Justice had been served, but healing would take much longer. Spring came early to Millbrook that year, as if nature itself was eager to wash away the bitter memories of the previous months. Dogwood trees bloomed in profusion along Main Street, their white and pink blossoms a stark contrast to the gray winter that had settled over the Patterson family like a suffocating blanket. Dolores stood at her kitchen window, watching Tyler tend to the vegetable garden he'd planted behind the house. It was mid-April, 8 months since Sarah Vance's conviction, and her grandson had been living with her for 6 of those months. The arrangement had started as necessity. Tyler's veterinary practice was slowly recovering, but the financial damage had been severe. But it had evolved into something neither of them had expected. A chance to rebuild not just their bank accounts but their relationship. The tomatoes are coming along nicely, Tyler called through the open window, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his gardening glove. At 32, he looked older but somehow more solid than he had during his marriage. The boyish naivety was gone, replaced by a harder-won wisdom that showed in the careful way he evaluated people and situations. Your grandfather would be proud, Dolores replied, remembering how Robert had spent hours in that same garden, coaxing vegetables from the red Georgia clay. He always said the best therapy was having your hands in the dirt. Tyler nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. They'd learned to communicate in these gentle layers over the past months, acknowledging pain without dwelling in it, finding healing in shared tasks and quiet conversations. The sound of tires on gravel announced Ruby May's arrival for their weekly financial meeting. These sessions had become a cornerstone of their recovery. Brutal honesty about money, careful planning for an uncertain future, and the slow rebuilding of financial security that Sarah's theft had destroyed. "Morning, family," Ruby May called as she entered the kitchen carrying a banker's box and her ever-present legal pad. At 55, she'd stepped naturally into the role of family financial guardian, her professional expertise now serving a more personal mission. "How are we looking this week?" Dolores asked, settling at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and a fresh cup of coffee. Ruby May spread out the documents with practiced efficiency. Better. Tyler's practice had its best month since the trial, and we've managed to rebuild the emergency fund to $8,000. It was a far cry from the $43,000 that had once been Dolores's funeral fund, but it represented something more valuable: their ability to recover from catastrophe. "Mrs. Henderson brought her cat in yesterday," Tyler added, settling into his chair. "First time she's used our clinic since. Well, since everything happened." The everything encompassed more than just Sarah's crimes. It included the media attention, the whispered conversations that stopped when Tyler entered a room, the way some longtime clients had quietly taken their business elsewhere. Millbrook was a small town with a long memory, and being the victim of a con artist carried its own stigma. "That's progress," Ruby May observed, making notes on her pad. "The community's healing too. It just takes time." They worked through the financial details for an hour. Insurance policies, retirement planning, the slow process of rebuilding credit that Sarah's identity theft had damaged. It was tedious work, but necessary. More importantly, it was honest. Work that brought them closer together instead of driving them apart. "There's something else we need to discuss," Ruby May said when they'd finished with the numbers. "I've been working with Detective Santos on establishing better protections for elderly residents. We're calling it the Millbrook Financial Safety Initiative." Dolores looked up from her checkbook. "What kind of protections?" "Automatic fraud alerts for unusual banking activity, required waiting periods for large withdrawals, training for bank staff to recognize signs of elder financial abuse." Ruby May's voice carried the passion of someone who'd seen firsthand how devastating such crimes could be. "We want to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Tyler leaned forward. "That's good work, Ruby May. Important work." "It's personal work," she corrected. "Sarah didn't just target you and Harold Cross. She victimized 17 elderly people in this county alone. If we don't protect them, who will?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Pastor Webb stood on the porch, his familiar smile tinged with the concern that had become his default expression since Sarah's arrest. At 62, he'd aged visibly during the ordeal, the weight of his parishioners' suffering settling into the lines around his eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, accepting Dolores's invitation to join them at the kitchen table. "Never," Dolores assured him. "You're always welcome here." Pastor Webb had become more than their spiritual advisor during the recovery process. He'd served as counselor, advocate, and fierce protector of his flock. The revelation that Sarah had targeted multiple members of his congregation had shaken him deeply, but it had also galvanized his resolve to help his community heal. "I wanted to discuss the service we talked about," he said, pulling out a small leather notebook. "The ceremony of renewal and healing. I think it's time." They'd been planning this for weeks, a small gathering to mark the family's journey from betrayal through recovery. Not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement of survival and a commitment to moving forward. "Who would you want to include?" Pastor Webb asked. "Harold, certainly," Dolores said immediately. The elderly widower had become a fixture in their lives, Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations gradually filling the void Sarah had exploited. "And the other victims who want to participate. This isn't just about our family." Tyler nodded. "It should include everyone who was hurt by this, everyone who's working to rebuild." The planning session stretched into the afternoon, punctuated by the arrival of Harold Cross himself. He moved more slowly now, the stress of the past year having taken its toll on his 82-year-old frame. But his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there during Sarah's manipulation. "I brought something," Harold announced, settling into the chair Tyler offered him. He pulled out a manila envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. "Letters from some of the other victims. People who want to be part of whatever we're doing here." The letters were heartbreaking in their honesty. Elderly people across the Southeast sharing their stories of betrayal, financial loss, and the long journey toward healing. But they were also inspiring, testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community support. "Mrs. Chen from Tennessee," Harold read aloud. "She says Sarah took $8,000 from her, but she's learned to trust again because of the support group Detective Santos helped establish." Tyler listened to letter after letter, each one a reminder that his family's suffering was part of a larger tapestry of pain and recovery. It was humbling to realize how many people had been hurt by the woman he'd married, but it was also oddly comforting to know they weren't alone in their struggle to rebuild. "There's one more thing," Harold said when he'd finished reading. "I've been thinking about what Sarah said to me near the end, about family being whatever you make it." The room grew quiet. Sarah's words had been manipulative, designed to exploit Harold's loneliness, but they contained a grain of truth that had taken on new meaning. "She was right about that," Harold continued. "Family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand by you when everything falls apart. The people who help you put the pieces back together. He looked around the table at the faces that had become as familiar as his own reflection. You've all become my family, not because of some lie Sarah told, but because of the truth we've built together. Tyler felt his eyes sting with unshed tears. Harold, you've become part of our family too. The grandfather I never had. The old man's smile was radiant. Then that's what we'll celebrate. Not what was taken from us, but what we've found. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to more practical matters. Tyler's business was slowly recovering, but he'd learned hard lessons about financial management and the importance of separating personal and professional accounts. The trauma counseling Pastor Webb had recommended was helping him process the guilt and betrayal, but progress was measured in small victories rather than dramatic breakthroughs. I still have nightmares sometimes, Tyler admitted. Dreams where I'm signing those documents again, trusting her completely. That's normal, Pastor Webb assured him. Betrayal trauma takes time to heal. The important thing is that you're not letting it make you bitter or cynical. I don't know how to trust my own judgment anymore, Tyler confessed. Every decision feels dangerous. Every person I meet might be lying. Dolores reached across the table and took her grandson's hand. That's why you have us. You don't have to navigate this alone. Ruby May nodded agreement. We're your safety net now, the people who'll tell you the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The conversation continued as the sun began to set, painting the kitchen in golden light that reminded Dolores of countless family dinners over the years. But this gathering felt different, more intentional, more precious because of how close they'd come to losing it all. I have something to confess, Dolores said suddenly, the words coming out before she could stop them. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her with concern. Sarah wasn't entirely wrong about me having memory problems, Dolores continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. I've been having some lapses. Nothing serious, but enough to worry me. Tyler's face went pale. Meemaw, why didn't you tell us? Because I was afraid you'd use it as an excuse for everything that happened, that you'd say Sarah was right about me being confused and forgetful. Dolores lifted her chin with characteristic stubbornness. But the truth is, memory problems or not, I knew something was wrong with that girl from the beginning. My instincts were right, even if my bank balance wasn't. Pastor Webb leaned forward. Have you seen a doctor? Dr. Martinez says it's normal aging, maybe some mild cognitive decline, but nothing dramatic. I'm not losing my mind, I'm just getting old. Dolores's laugh was wry. Though I suppose there's not much difference sometimes. The admission hung in the air, another layer of truth added to their collective healing. Ruby May was the first to respond. Then we adjust, she said practically. Better documentation, more oversight, systems to protect against exploitation. We turn this into strength instead of weakness. Tyler squeezed his grandmother's hand. We're going to take care of each other. All of us. As the evening wound down, they finalized plans for the renewal ceremony. It would be small, just family and close friends, the victims who wanted to participate, and the law enforcement officers who'd helped them rebuild. Pastor Webb would officiate, Harold would read some of the letters they'd received, and Tyler would speak about the lessons they'd learned. What will you say? Dolores asked her grandson as they cleared the dishes. Tyler was quiet for a moment, considering. That love makes us vulnerable, but vulnerability isn't weakness. That family is worth fighting for, even when the fight is against someone you thought you loved. He paused, looking out the window at the garden he'd planted, neat rows of vegetables that would feed them through the summer, a living symbol of growth and renewal. And that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what really matters. Dolores nodded, understanding. They'd lost money, innocence, and illusions. But they'd found each other again and built something stronger than what Sarah had tried to destroy. The healing wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real. And in the end, that was enough. Outside, the dogwoods bloomed in the gathering dusk, their white flowers ghostly in the moonlight. Spring had come to Millbrook, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. 1 year to the day after Sarah Vance's sentencing, the Patterson family gathered around Dolores's dining room table for Tyler's 32nd birthday. The same table where wedding gifts had once been displayed now held a simple chocolate cake Ruby May had baked, flanked by wildflowers from the garden Tyler had tended through every season of his recovery. The guest list was small but meaningful. Harold Cross sat at the place of honor to Dolores's right, his presence no longer that of a victim seeking solace, but of a beloved patriarch who'd earned his seat through love and loyalty. Ruby May and Pastor Webb flanked the table's other side, their faces relaxed in a way that had seemed impossible during the dark months of investigation and trial. But it was the young woman beside Tyler who drew Dolores's most careful attention. Emma Sullivan was 28, a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, with gentle hands and intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's heart. She'd appeared in Tyler's life 6 months ago, not with fanfare or calculated charm, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that real love was built on truth rather than performance. "I still can't believe you made this yourself," Emma said to Ruby May, admiring the perfectly layered cake. "I can barely manage boxed brownies without burning them." "Cooking is like banking," Ruby May replied with a smile. "It's all about following the recipe and paying attention to the details." Tyler laughed, the sound carrying none of the hollow echo it had held during the months immediately following Sarah's conviction. "Emma's talents lie elsewhere. You should see her classroom. It's like something out of a storybook." "Stop," Emma protested, blushing prettily. "You're embarrassing me in front of your family." "Good," Dolores said firmly. "If you're going to be part of this family, you might as well get used to being embarrassed by us." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with implication. Emma looked at Tyler with raised eyebrows, and he took her hand with the confidence of a man who'd learned to trust his own judgment again. "Actually," Tyler said, his voice carrying a nervous excitement that reminded Dolores of the boy who'd once asked permission to adopt a stray dog. "There's something we wanted to tell you all." Emma's left hand moved slightly on the table, revealing a simple gold band with a modest diamond that caught the candlelight. The engagement ring was nothing like the elaborate affair Sarah had demanded. It was honest and understated and perfect. "Tyler asked me to marry him last night," Emma said, her voice soft with wonder. "And I said yes." The table erupted in congratulations and tears, Harold Cross thumping Tyler on the back while Ruby May immediately began planning engagement parties, and Pastor Webb beamed with the satisfaction of watching his flock find happiness again. But Dolores simply studied Emma's face, looking for any hint of calculation or false emotion. What she found instead was genuine joy, deep affection for Tyler, and something else. A protective instinct that reminded Dolores of her own fierce love for family. "Emma," Dolores said when the excitement had settled, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you see in my grandson?" It was the same question she'd never asked Sarah, and the difference in Emma's response was illuminating. "I see someone who's been hurt but chose to heal instead of becoming bitter," Emma said without hesitation. "Someone who puts others before himself, who works with his hands to help creatures that can't help themselves. Someone who loves his family enough to fight for them, even when it costs him everything." Emma paused, looking directly at Dolores, with the respect of someone who understood the older woman's protective instincts. "I see someone who's learned the difference between being loved and being used, and I see someone I want to spend my life proving worthy of." Dolores felt tears sting her eyes. That's a good answer. There's more, Tyler said, squeezing Emma's hand. We want to be married here, in the church where Meemaw and Grandpa Robert were married, with Pastor Webb officiating and all of you standing with us. A small wedding, Emma added quickly. Just family and close friends. Nothing elaborate. Or expensive. Dolores thought of the lavish affair that had nearly bankrupted her a year ago, then looked around the table at the faces that had become her chosen family through trial and tribulation. That sounds perfect, she said simply. As the birthday. Dinner progressed. Conversation flowed easily between past and future, acknowledging the scars they all carried while celebrating the strength they'd found. Harold shared stories of his late wife Margaret, his voice no longer tinged with the loneliness that Sarah had exploited. Ruby May talked about the Millbrook Financial Safety Initiative, which had now been adopted by 3 neighboring counties. Pastor Webb described the healing workshops he'd been leading for. Dolores's laugh was wry. Though I suppose there's not much difference sometimes. The admission hung in the air, another layer of truth added to their collective healing. Ruby May was the first to respond. Then we adjust, she said practically. Better documentation, more oversight, systems to protect against exploitation. We turn this into strength instead of weakness. Tyler squeezed his grandmother's hand. We're going to take care of each other, all of us. As the evening wound down, they finalized plans for the renewal ceremony. It would be small, just family and close friends, the victims who wanted to participate, and the law enforcement officers who'd helped them rebuild. Pastor Webb would officiate, Harold would read some of the letters they'd received, and Tyler would speak about the lessons they'd learned. What will you say? Dolores asked her grandson as they cleared the dishes. Tyler was quiet for a moment, considering. That love makes us vulnerable, but vulnerability isn't weakness. That family is worth fighting for, even when the fight is against someone you thought you loved. He paused, looking out the window at the garden he'd planted. Neat rows of vegetables that would feed them through the summer, a living symbol of growth and renewal. And that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what really matters. Crime victims throughout the state. When the cake had been eaten and the presents opened, simple gifts that spoke of deep understanding rather than expensive gesture. Dolores rose from her chair. The room fell quiet as she reached for her water glass, the gesture carrying echoes of that fateful wedding toast that had changed everything. A year ago, Dolores began, her voice steady and clear, I stood at a wedding reception and gave a toast that some folks called the most uncomfortable moment in Millbrook social history. Gentle laughter rippled around the table, the memory, no longer painful but transformed into something approaching family legend. I spoke about my funeral fund and how it had been spent on someone else's dream. I was angry and hurt and scared, and I used that toast to declare war on a woman who was stealing from my family. Dolores paused, looking at each face around the table. Harold, who'd found family again. Ruby May, who'd become the protector she'd always been meant to be. Pastor Webb, whose faith had been tested and strengthened. Tyler, who'd lost his innocence, but found his backbone. And Emma, who represented hope and second chances. Tonight, I want to give a different kind of toast, Dolores continued. To the real wealth we've discovered in this past year. Not money, though we're grateful for what we've been able to rebuild. Not possessions or status or the approval of people who don't really know us. She raised her glass higher, her hand, steady despite her 79 years. To the wealth that can't be stolen because it lives in our hearts. To the family we were born into and the family we've chosen. To the truth that sets us free, even when it costs us everything. To love that sees clearly and chooses to stay anyway. Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the authority of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged with her soul intact. To Tyler and Emma, who represent the future we're building together. To Harold, who shows us that family is about choice, not blood. To Ruby May and Pastor Webb, who remind us that community means standing together when the world falls apart. Dolores's eyes met Tyler's across the table, seeing the boy she'd raised and the man he'd become. And to the lesson Sarah Vance taught us without meaning to, that the people who truly love you will tell you hard truths and stand by you through the consequences. That real wealth is measured not in what you have, but in who you have it with. She raised her glass in a final gesture. To family, to truth, to the courage to begin again. The response was immediate and heartfelt, glasses clinking around the table as 5 voices joined in unison. To family. As the evening wound down and guests began to help clear dishes, Dolores stood at her kitchen window watching Tyler and Emma walk hand in hand through the garden. The vegetables he'd planted in grief and desperation had flourished through every season, providing sustenance and hope when both had seemed impossible. Harold appeared beside her, moving slowly but steadily. "You did good tonight," he said quietly. "That toast, it was perfect." "It was honest," Dolores corrected. "That's all I know how to be anymore." "Sarah took our money," Harold observed. "But she gave us something too. She showed us what we really had." Dolores nodded, understanding. The funeral fund was gone, her financial independence diminished, her trust damaged but not destroyed. Yet standing in her kitchen surrounded by the evidence of love and loyalty, she felt richer than she had in years. The grandfather clock chimed. 10 o'clock, its familiar sound marking another day survived, another step forward in their collective healing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Emma's integration into the family, wedding planning, the ongoing work of rebuilding trust, and security. But tonight, in this moment, they were whole. Scarred but stronger, poorer in money but richer in wisdom, forever changed by betrayal, but not broken by it. Dolores smiled, thinking of Robert and how proud he would be of the family they'd built and rebuilt. The last toast had been given not in anger or pain, but in gratitude for the chance to begin again. And in the soft Georgia darkness, surrounded by love that had been tested and proven true, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.